All right. Welcome to the ninth Symposium on Environmental Justice and Health Disparities with the University of Maryland Siege, Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health. My name is Pamela Bingham. I'm the Operations Manager for the Siege at UMD in the School of Public Health. And we are really excited today to have another outstanding panel who's going to explain a product they're developing called the HE-Jet or the H-Jet. This panel is entitled The Use of Screening Tools to Advance Environmental and Climate Justice 2, Introduction of the HBCU Environmental Justice Screening Tool. We're very, very happy to have the team that has been working on this tool, and I will introduce them. Carrie R. Harris, who is the program manager and a PMP for the HBCU EJET, HJET. I can't say it now. EJET. She is now working with the team as project manager. Dr. Reginald Archer, assistant professor, agricultural and environmental sciences in the College of Agriculture at Tennessee State University. Dr. Linda Lobert, associate professor of economics at Morgan State University. Dr. Paul Robinson, assistant professor at Charles Drew University, retired associate professor in the Built Environment Department from North Carolina A&T University, Dr. Tony Graham, and joining us later, Dr. David Paget, associate professor of geography and director of the Geographic and Information Systems Laboratory at Tennessee State University. Our lovely and wonderful moderator today is Carrie R. Harris. First, let me provide the description of the session for those of you who are joining us. The Biden administration has developed an initiative entitled Justice 40, requiring that environmental funding be allocated to the 40% most disadvantaged communities in the United States in various federal programs. The administration also released the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. After the release of the CJIS, there was a vigorous discussion about the tool's release without an indicator for race and the implications of ignoring this indicator in determining which communities were designated as disadvantaged. The HBCU EJ technical team, the HEJET, members have been working on the democratization of GIS for several decades. They began to evaluate communities in the southern United States to determine the potential impacts of ignoring race as an indicator. After analysis, the HEJET was selected by the Bullard Center in Texas Southern University to develop a screening tool with a race indicator. In this session, panelists representing HBCUs will address some preliminary findings of the team's analyses. The panelists will discuss how the new tool can be used to better identify communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards, and they will share examples of how the tool has been used to advocate for environmental protection and climate adaptation, where other environmental justice screening and mapping tools have fallen short. The session will conclude with some discussion of the limitations of the tool and ways in which the tool can be improved or enhanced and opportunities moving forward. The panelists will also discuss partnerships between HBCUs, community-based organizations, and policymakers to advocate for the effective delivery of Justice 40 benefits to overburdened and disadvantaged communities. At this time, we will turn it over to Ms. Carrie Harris. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pamela Bingham. Thank you so much for everything that you contribute to the team. You also are part of the team, which I don't know if you mentioned, but you've been an instrumental member of the team. And we're just really excited to kind of talk about a lot of the research and the developments in our tool that we've made today. As you can see in the picture, we've got Ms. Pam on our team, and we got Mr. David A. Paget. We also have Dr. King, who's at the Bullard Center. So it's really been a collaborative effort. We were formed in 2022 as a collaborative effort across HBCU affiliated data scientists, geoscientists, economists, public health experts, and geographic information systems experts, which is GIS. And currently, we're working on the development of a Justice 40 federal spending tracking tool, but we also still do a lot of work and we present a lot of workshops talking about the tool that we developed last year. And it's really a beta tool, but we do a lot of work with it. And essentially, that tool layers racial data across all the 74 plus thousand census tracts in the country onto the data that's currently in the seizures tool, which Dr. Lubier will talk about later on in the panel. She's also going to get into the methodology that seizures use to even determine a tract as disadvantaged. So we're really excited for this session. Something that's really important that we want to share with you is our primary goal in the work that we do. Although everyone on the team is super technical and has expertise in all these kind of technical regions, our goal is to empower environmental justice stakeholders. We want to support organizations with their grant applications. We want to support environmental justice organization, environmental justice organization, organizations by just giving them information and awareness and data on the communities in which they live. And we do that through the projects that we've been working on that have been funded by the Bullard Center. Big shout out to them, Dr. Robert Bullard and Dr. Danae King, funding our group to do this research. And we use ArcGIS mostly to get this work done. And so ultimately, today we're going to talk a lot about what our team is doing. We're going to hear from Dr. Reginald Archer, who's on the board of EJ Screen at APA. We're going to hear from Dr. Linda Lubier, who's an economist at Morgan State University, working on this as well as some redlining research from the perspective of appraisers. We're also going to hear from our lead developer, GIS developer at Charles G. University, Dr. Paul Robinson. And we're going to hear from Dr. Tony Graham, who has an amazing presentation on environmental racism from the perspective of an engineer and environmental justice in the built environment. And so as you can see, we talked about it a little bit, but here we're working closely with Dr. Robert Bullard, who is on the White House Environmental Justice Council, and we are, leveraging the experts on this team to provide research and data supporting his main point, which is that environmental racism, disparities according to race and ethnicity are really important, and race is left out of the tool, which is a big problem when thinking about the fact that environmental racism is mostly a byproduct of racism. And so as you can see here, Dr. Bullard is with President Biden on the day that he signed an executive order creating the White House Office of Environmental Justice. And there's Dr. Peggy Shepard in the photograph as well, who we spent a good deal of time with. And so what I'm going to do is pass it over to Dr. Reginald Archer. Again, he's a professor at Tennessee State University. He's also a GISP, meaning he's an expert in the environmental, in the GIS environment. And he has an awesome presentation for you all on how to leverage EJ Screen to support environmental justice organizations and further the information that you have on the communities that you're a part of. We can just pretend that they're giving you a round of applause, Dr. Archer.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Ms. Harris. I also wanted to just go back real quick and recognize Administrator Michael Reagan from the White House as well. I'm going to talk about just real quick correction. I'm associate professor at Tennessee State University, and I would like to discuss today. I'm going to give an overview of the EJ screen, which is the EPA's environmental justice screening tool. And we're building on this whole conversation today. We're going to be building on how we started the conversation yesterday. When Reverend Barber spoke, he asked the question, where are we? And so these tools that we're about to demonstrate really literally will help us to understand where we are in the context of environmental justice, environmental injustices, environmental justice issues, and the tools that are available to us to identify and locate our communities, our homes, our residences, our businesses, etc., in these places. And one of those tools is the EJ screen. We can skip to the next slide. So a little bit of background. The EPA developed this tool several years ago, around 2014. I think it came out in 2013, so at least 10 years ago. And it builds on a 2010 report from the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee on EJ screening and prior EPA experiences. The tool is developed to be nationally consistent or use nationally consistent data sets. And what does that mean? That means that data is collected all around the country to help us to understand our environmental impacts and environmental justice issues. But in order to be able to look at the data across the country, we have to use data that is collected consistently or in a consistent way and in a consistent framework so that we can compare cities to cities or counties to counties or block groups to block groups and states to states. And that's what the EJ screening and mapping tool does. The gist of the tool is it combines environmental and demographic socioeconomic indicators. The other thing about the tool is that it's web-based. It's a GIS or Geographic Information System tool, and the data is web-based and it's free to use, freely accessible to the public, and you don't need to download anything except the reports when you're done with the analysis that you can do in the EJ screen. EJ screen is a tool that has been peer reviewed by expert and continues to be peer reviewed by expert and scientific advisors. I sit on one of the scientific advisory boards for EJ screen currently. And so that's a little bit of the background of EJ screen. Some of the key features, there are several ways that the EJ screen represents progress relative to prior efforts. So there are 13 environmental justice indexes in the tool. There are updated demographics collected annually or annually updated data collected from the U.S. Census Bureau and the American Community Survey. So that is average over 5-year time periods. Again, it's web accessible, and you can print reports, maps, bar graphs, and different ways to examine the data, and I'll get to those here shortly. It's also something that is interesting about the EJ screen now is the resolution of the maps have gotten much better. When it initially started, we were about 3 or 4 times better than it was when it first started. So in the last 10 years, it's really, really improved how we can view the maps. And that resolution refers to now we can look at data at the block group level. In addition to that, you can also download raw data from the EJ screen. As I was mentioning earlier, there are 13 environmental indicators, 7 socioeconomic indicators, 13 indexes, EJ indexes, and that's a combination of environmental and socioeconomic indicators, as well as some supplemental indicators, and I'll show you the list of those and what those consist of here in a moment. The tool also provides a number of capabilities, including color-coded mapping, as well as being able to generate reports for a selected area, an area that you select. You're also able to bring in your own data or your own maps and your own geographic areas into the map so you can see what they look like and compare them to what the indexes show you. So here's just a table of the environmental indicators. There's a lot of details here, so I won't go into every one, but the key mediums, we look at air, water, and some other aspects, waste. And you can see the different indicators here: particulate matter, 2.5, so PM 2.5, ozone, diesel particulate matter, air toxics, cancer risk, air toxics, respiratory hazard index. So each of these indicators are brought into the environmental justice screening tool and combined with demographic indicators that I'll show you here in the next slide. I'll say the two demographic indexes that you saw in the slide previous are is a demographic index that is based on the average of two demographic indicators: percent low income as well as percent people of color, and then socioeconomic. Supplemental indexes. Supplemental demographic index based on the average of 5 socioeconomic indicators. So quite a few different factors that are brought in to develop these indexes in order to provide the user with the best information possible in order to have a better understanding or be able to screen out where there might be some issues that might need some further understanding. So we'll get into that here as well. The people of color, go back to that screen. So people of color, socioeconomic indicators, the percent of individuals of a block group who list as their racial status as a race, low income, unemployment rate, limited English speaking, less than a high school education, under age 5 and over age 64. And for each of these indicators has a complete description of what they explore and why they're used by the EPA at the EPA website. So if you're interested in any of these indicators, or if you have questions about why, the EPA EJ Screen website has a complete list of helpful information to help you guide you through all of these different indicators. So anyone's free to use EJ Screen, as I mentioned. It's supposed to be a tool for everyone. We hope it will provide better communication, that it can further dialogue between environmental justice or around environmental justice issues. It's not required by state or tribal partners for anyone to use in any context, but there are, the EPA uses them in various contexts though. Outreach and engagement, many aspects of their environmental programs, and geographically based initiatives. Again, where are we? Well, we're somewhere in the environment, and so we can use these tools to help us understand and answer that question in sort of a literal way. It also helps to highlight areas that may warrant additional consideration. So once the idea is that the tool can be used as a screening tool, not necessarily for a specific analysis, but that it can highlight areas that demonstrate what is the risk of where I live or my area that I'm concerned with compared to other areas in the country. We do that by using a percentile index score. And the EPA is already using these tools to highlight other areas that warrant additional consideration. So it's been doing so for several years now. But there are some limits to the tools as well. We can go to the next slide. The EJ Screen tool should be used as just a starting point. It's for pre-decision in a sense. It's just to kind of give you an indication of where there might be some issues and where we should dig further and where we should go and supplement our data with more local data. So local data really tells the true story of where the environmental issues might be, but when comparing them to other areas in the United States, that's when we would look at EJ Screen and highlight those areas. So again, it's a baseline screening, and it should not be used to label areas as EJ communities, but it can provide some indications. I mentioned the demographics are based on this 5-year averages of the American Community Survey data. The environmental and the proximity indicators are screen level proxies. So they don't provide actual exposure or risk, but they provide a way to compare our data to other parts of the country. And of course, they don't cover all of the environmental indicators or issues. They don't cover all community issues. And we should also consider additional local information. Those are some of the data and tools that you may be able to bring into EJ Screen as needed. The EJ Screen is also based on historical data. So it's not always updated data. It's historical data, and it's may not necessarily be the newest data, but the one thing we can be sure of is that it is data that has been collected consistently across the entire country, collected in the same way. But it's important to understand how the data is collected and when the data is collected. And again, all of the documentation about everything in the EJ Screen is included on the EJ Screen website. And there's lots of videos and other supplemental information to help guide you through that. So let's take a look at some of the maps quickly here and the types of data that you can access. So the geographic unit is the block group, and you can see the color-coded irregular polygons here. So this is the smallest unit or the highest resolution that the EJ Screen data can access. And we know that the average block group has about 1,400 residents, again, to provide sort of this national consistent data. The results, when you grab a particular area that you're interested in, then you can see the results identified as percentiles. And they put these indicators in the common units between 0 and 100. So placing the 80th percentile nationwide means that 20% of the U.S. population has a higher value than this 80th percentile. If you're at the 90th percentile, then only 10% of the U.S. population has a higher value, meaning that this area that you're interested in has a pretty high value compared to other areas. So this, again, this doesn't.
Sorry, Dr. Archer, 1 minute.
So this doesn't mean that the risks are equal or comparable, but this is an indicator that you can look at, again, to screen that area. Next slide. So the EJ index itself, the index and those values you get, combines the environmental data and the demographic data in a geographic location. That's the easiest way to think about it. Next slide. When you view the reports, you get a standard report that gives you all the indicators in a single specified location. And then you can see the map that gives you time over the various block groups. So you get several ways to visualize the data and the indicators. Next slide. You can specify your own area within the tool. You can highlight your own area in order to get and create buffers around that area if you need to, in order to look at the data for a particular area. So aside from the block groups and the county level data and the state level data, you can also supply your own polygon to examine the data. All right. Next slide. I think we're reaching the end here. It's standard report format. Again, any information about this you can find on the EJ Screen tools and website. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. These other tools, it's just examples of the maps and the indicators here, and that's the next couple of slides. So I know we're running, time is low, so I'll go ahead and skip through these. But these are just examples of the different ways we can highlight the indicators. And then we can print out reports for each of these. And you can also add other layers once your EJ Screen has some other layers that are not included in the analysis that EJ Screen does, but that you can use to visualize within the tool itself. Okay, here's some sample types of additional data, and yeah, I'll stop there. Just this is the last screen you can take a look at to understand, and you can share those if needed or answer questions at the end. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Linda Lubert. Next slide. I'm going to give you just an overview of the CEGIS tool, which is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool that we refer to as CEGIS. Just a little history. It's a critical component of the Biden-Harris commitment to advancing environmental justice. So it's kind of referred to as Justice 40 Initiative. And it was signed into as an executive order back in January 27th of 2020. The deal was that there was a need to have a geospatial component, a mapping tool, so that the federal agencies who would be making sure that environment, things were being taken care of from their aspect, they could have something to identify disadvantaged communities that were facing burdens that were related to climate change, environment, health, and economic activity opportunities. Next. So the government agencies, that were tackling these climate crisis, they were going to be providing investments in 7 areas. 1, climate change, clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable and sustainable housing, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, and development of critical and clean water and wastewater infrastructure, as well as training and workforce development. Here again, they needed to identify, well, who were these where were these disadvantaged areas and communities? So, which brings in that whole geospatial aspect. So the CGIS, they developed this tool, CGIS tool. It's a web application, and it's an open data platform, and the open source community is there to help policymakers, as well as the federal program offices, make a better decision about where they're going to direct the benefits of their particular program. So we're talking about all of the federal agencies in the government, or those that had something to do with climate and environment. So the tool, again, is an interactive map with indicators and displays the communities that as being identified by the Council on Environmental Quality definition. Oh, yeah, that definition. What is that definition? I'll get to that. It makes the list of communities that and other data sets available for download, so that people who are trying to get the monies or benefits out there available to them for the public. Next. So how are we going to define disadvantaged communities? So they came up with this. Communities are considered disadvantaged if they are in census tract that meet the threshold for at least one of the tools categories of burden. And you can see this map. It's like been identified, and these are the census tract. Next. So communities are considered disadvantaged if they are located in these census tracts that meet the threshold for at least one of the burdens. So this tool that CGIS came up with uses data sets, and Reggie kind of talked about some of the data sets that's already out there for understanding what's going on in our communities, uses as indicators of burdens. So 1, again, at least at or above the threshold for one of them, environmental, climate, or other burdens, and 2, at or above the threshold. And using this word, a threshold, so you have to understand they came up with thresholds for an associated socioeconomic burden, and also if a tract is completely surrounded by disadvantaged communities and or at above the 50% percentile for low income. So the idea was to secure environmental justice and make sure that there was some economic opportunities for these disadvantaged communities that have historically been overlooked. Next. So let's look at them really quick. The first one is climate change. And now you can see 1 through 5, all of the burdens that they came up with and what percentile you had to be above, at least, and a socioeconomic burden of income, low income. So that was for climate change. Next, the next one, this is the second one, energy burden. So energy costs, what are those, the actual definitions that you had to prove that you were at? energy cost greater or above the 90th percentile. Your particulate matter in the air greater or above 90 percentile, and low income. Next, the next one, the third one, health burden. So we've got the health. And so we're looking at asthma, diabetes, heart, and low life expectancy. And again, also low income. Next, housing burdens. So what with housing burdens? So they have some definitions exactly for that. Historic under investigation, housing cost greater than the 90th percentile, lack of green space, all of these different things, including lead paint greater than the 90th percentile, and low income. Next, pollution legacy burden. Well, what is that? Oh, okay. Those places like that had abandoned mine present, yeah, and that's a yes or no. Formerly used defense site present, yes or no. Hazardous waste site, are you that's close, greater than the 90th percentile. Super funds, 90th, greater or equal to the 90th percentile, or proximity to risk management plans, greater or equal to the 90th percentile, as well as low income. Transportation burden, yes. Well, now we're talking, diesel particulate matter, greater or equal to the 90th percentile. Transportation barriers, greater or equal to the 90th percentile. And what about traffic? Traffic proximity and volume greater than or equal to the 90th percentile, and low income. Next, water and wastewater burdens. So are there any underground storage tank and release that's greater than the 90th percentile, or wastewater discharge that's there, it's greater or equal to the 90th percentile, and low income? Next. So now we're going to the workforce development. So are there language issues, isolation issues greater than or equal to the 90th percentile, or low and medium income, poverty, unemployment, all high unemployment, and high school less than 10%, having a high school education. Next. So those were the 8 components of the CJS, the categories that they look, and you see how they came up with all of those. They had to see if places were greater than all of the indicators that I showed within those categories. So the most important variable that we see, though, is not in that, and that's race. And we feel that it's an important variable. And we can show you kind of why. Let's take those 8 categories and let's see what are the percentages of African Americans in those census tracts. Next slide. So we've got the 8 categories for disadvantaged areas. So it's not disadvantaged if it's a 0. So 8% of African Americans live in where there are no disadvantage. It's not a disadvantaged area. But if you keep going, having an additional burden added to it, category of burden added to it, you see that the percent of African American increases all the way up to having 8 of those categories within that census tract. And you see almost 60% of the people, African Americans, live that. And it is the total reverse when you look at the average percent of whites who live in those areas. So 70% of whites live in areas that have it's not considered disadvantaged by all of those things that I just defined. And it keeps going down. And when you get to number 8, having 8 of them, only 12% of white population are living in tracts with 8 of those categories. And next. And so we can look at those different categories, and we can look at a lot of different things about them and actually find out the percentages and see this a description of how many are in those areas. So this is kind of just if there's unemployment, the average, if you If it's in an 8 area, you have 8 categories in it, you have a really high unemployment rate. And you can see by this, I won't get into all of this, but anyway, that kind of gives you an idea of how and why race becomes an important part of the CGIS tool. Next, it's for, okay. Paul. Paul.
Dr. Robinson. We need you to unmute.
Sorry about that. I thought I was starting at 11:49. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So following on from Dr. Luber's presentation, our group, the HBCU Environmental Justice Technical Support Team, was asked by the Bullard Center to address this issue of race not being put into the CGIS tool by the White House. So in our first meeting, we were given a preview of the beta version of the CGIS tool, and race was completely left out of the equation. And the rationale that they gave, that I was told, was that the White House is afraid of getting sued if they put race as a criteria for determining disadvantage. So that has been left out. So in the first version, it was entirely left out of the CGIS tool that you just had an overview of. So we were at that meeting, and we gave a presentation to show, similar to what you saw Dr. Luber talk about, and I'll show a little bit of that shortly, to show how race is critical to determining, has been critical to determining people's position in American cities over time through we know about the segregation. There's, any group of people in any nation state or any territory go through a dialectic process of kind of settling out. And you have winners and losers. You have some people are on top, some people aren't. And in American cities, being white meant you're going to be on top, right? You're starting ahead of everybody else. And a lot of what you see now is to redress those histories. So in terms of environmental justice, pollution has been put in communities of color. Pollution has been put not based on income, but often based on race or ethnicity. So we thought it was a good idea to address that. And so we were actually tasked with the job of reintroducing race to this environmental justice modeling or tool building exercises that are going on. So the next version of the CGIS, that is now the current version, that was released in, I think, the fall of 22, and I believe in response to our protestations at the original unveiling of the beta version at the meeting we were on, they added race back in to the database, but it is not in CGIS available to layer. So you can get the numbers as you were seeing, but you can't visualize it. You can't understand the geographic implications of race. And so our tool is not the answer to CGIS. It's not a better CGIS. It's a supplement of CGIS, which puts important information back at the hands of the people that would be using that tool. And it also sets in context because race is a very local phenomenon, right? Black people or people of color in cities are at odds with people in their same cities, not with people across the country that are, of a different race or something. So you got to understand how race played out in a metropolitan context. And so we're going to go ahead and look at some examples of that going forward, right? And so you can I was going to put it in chat. That's the tool. It's a public-facing tool. It was designed for our a network of community-based organizations, but anybody can use it. So it's set up to support our the Bullard Center and the Deep South Center's network of community-based organizations that we're working with. But again, anybody can use it. It has all the data from CGIS and a little bit of supplemental data that we've added. We have some flood zone layers that you can turn on and off there when you get to the very local levels. So we encourage anyone to take a look at that and use it if you find that fit. Sorry, on to the next slide. So here's an example of this tool zoomed in the Houston area. And so there's two layers turned on here. The first layer is the yellow circles are the number of criteria that were explained in the previous presentation. So there's 8 different criteria: climate change, and other housing. There's many different, you just saw all the categories. So you can go to the CGIS site and see the 8 categories. So if the circle is the largest circle are census tracts where over 8, all 8 of the criteria are exceeded. If there's no circle in a census tract, none of the criteria were exceeded. And what we noticed when we started to layer race on top of the categories exceeded, you start to see interesting patterns. And as Dr. Lubert showed, so this is downtown Houston, just south of downtown. Anywhere west of Main Street, there are no criteria exceeded. And you can see that the percentages of African Americans are very low, 0 to 4%, 0%. As you move across Houston towards the east into the 3rd ward, you start to see that many of the communities suffer extreme environmental burdens. And but there's one interesting pattern that emerges, and this emerges in almost every city I've looked at. Not bougie, but just successful African American communities. And when I say successful, meaning the people aren't all extremely poor, are left out of this equation completely. So you can see we're looking at the area around Texas Southern, and all of the areas around McGregor Park, south of Houston, are heavily African American, but they don't have designation. Now, if you looked at the criteria that Dr. Lubert was showing, what you might find in these situations is that all of the pollution criteria are exceeded, but not the income criteria, right? Now, we know that pollution doesn't stop at the streets. Pollution passes streets, pollution blows in the air, it flows in the water. It's also social conditions, poverty around you, violence around you could cause your neighborhood to be subjected to that. So areas that are adjacent to places that are considered disadvantaged, and because of that adjacency, and in some cases being surrounded, but maybe the people work at Texas Southern, so they're not necessarily poor, they don't get any of the federal designation of the Justice 40 program. But we all know that in those communities, it looks pretty much the same. Maybe the houses are a little nicer, the yards might be a little, there may not be the projects, but right around there, and the social conditions of those communities are often very similar to the surrounding conditions. So move on to the next slide. So we think that there's gaps in the data-based on-off Boolean approach that the CGIST is using to determine neighborhood disadvantage. It's leaving very important gaps, and particularly in African-American communities. So this is New Orleans here. And so again, this is New Orleans, east side of New Orleans, and you can see the blue star there is one of our community-based organizations. So we have all those on the map, and we're working with them to define their boundaries. But what you can see is that if you look to the lower left part of this map, Gentilly Terrace, Gentilly Woods, all the way to Lake Pontchartrain are not considered disadvantaged neighborhoods, but they're surrounded by areas that have many criteria exceeded, right? Now, if you were to drive from the west side of this map across Gentilly Terrace into this east side like say from one of the big areas that has the big 8 criteria across, you're not going to notice that much difference in who lives there. And I've clicked on those census tracts. They have 70% African American, 60% poverty. They have many of the burdens, but because they don't exceed the low income threshold, they do not get the designation. You can see over here, east of our community center, you have the same thing. So you have these neighborhoods, and this is something that occurs in Black neighborhoods. It doesn't, as you saw on the other map, the white neighborhoods don't have any, most of them in most cities don't have any criteria exceeded, right? But you have these areas that in Africa, predominantly African American communities, where neighborhoods are being penalized because they have many of the pollution burdens, but they're not low income. Or at least they don't meet the 90% threshold for being low income that this CGIS tool puts together. So we're not alone in making these observations. Many studies have, actually there's a Science magazine article, Science, the Journal of Science article that was written recently where they said that this tool will actually likely enhance disparities in environmental justice, not decrease it, for the very reasons that we're talking about, where by using this Boolean on-off, yes-no approach, and income being always the one determinant without considering race, because that leads to problems. Go to the next slide. I think I'm probably running low on time here. One more slide. Oh, okay. Actually, I left one slide out. So if you can go back to that last slide, I'll just finish up. So we have notified our collaborators at CGIS. We've actually shown them this tool. We've actually done this presentation for the White House Advisory Committee to try to demonstrate that there's got to be something besides just using those criteria along with income, because it leaves out neighborhoods who suffer the burden of race and maybe not income. But we all know that African-American life has been prescribed by race, regardless of income. Driving while Black has nothing to do with how much money you make. It has to do with whether you're Black. Being polluted while Black has nothing to do with whether your neighborhood is composed of people in the projects or people who work at Texas Southern or in the hospital or in the post office or whatever. It's still likely to be subject to the pollution of the environment, the surrounding community. So this is why geography and place-based specificity is very important. And so data-based approaches, and I'm not knocking the team at the Council of Environmental Quality at the White House. They probably didn't have access to geographers. They probably had programmers, doctors, health professionals who don't understand the importance of place. And when you map things out and understand the flow of activities, people, goods through space, that's what geographers do. And pollution, environmental equity, environmental justice has been proscribed by space and place and race and the relationship between them, in addition to income. So all of the money in the world can't save you from being polluted if you live in a neighborhood surrounded by other polluted areas because you're Black bourgeoisie or Black professionals. It's particularly in the South, African Americans of professional status, those of us who've made it, tend to live in areas surrounded by other aspects of our community. So this tool does not address that. And I think we've shown the case. And again, there's a Science Journal of Science article just recently came out to make that same point from more of a statistical perspective. But our tool allows our community groups to drill into their communities, visualize this problem, print out maps, print out reports from that very interface. And so that's what we're working with them to do. So I think I'm done. I'll take any question, or actually on to Tony, and then we'll take questions at the end.
That was great. That was great. Linda was a great lead in to Paul. Reggie was a great lead in to Linda, and Paul, you summed it up exactly right. And so my take on it is a little bit different from everybody, because I'm coming from a perspective of the built environment. And what Linda and Reggie and Paul have all described is precisely what's going on in the built environment and how the built environment cannot be left out of this tool set. And so, Karee, go ahead on and start the part, and you skip that. We can make corrections on that later. All right. So my perspective is I'm dealing with infrastructure. I'm looking at inequalities in the infrastructure and how they relate to all of the things that the panelists have brought up to date. And so as far as back as 2021, there's been studies by the American Society of Civil Engineers that's pointed out the conditions of our infrastructure. But what has historically received less attention is the role of infrastructure, construction, and maintenance has played in promoting inequality and racial segregation. And so I want to hop on that because this is really leading up to a lot of the environmental conditions our neighborhoods are experiencing. And Dr. Robinson hit right on. Pollution doesn't care what your race and background is. You're going to get sick, period. So next slide. You went too far. Come back. Okay, thank you. And so in 1921, under the Harding administration, under the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, federal guidelines were established for zoning ordinances nationally. And so here's where we got to be careful when we start dealing with things on a national level in guidelines and regulations and policies and ordinances. So the states took it to the next level, or people within the states took it to the next level, and they created a code of ethics that prevented anyone of another race moving into a predominantly white neighborhood. And that led to the beginning of the intentional segregation of our American cities. And therefore, the racism of the physical environment is built into a lot of our infrastructure. That recognition is what helped shape President Biden's infrastructure bill, to recognize that racism was built into our physical built environment, and we had to do something about it. This was brought up by Dr. Luber in her presentation as well. Next slide, please. One of the greatest, clearest examples of inequality in infrastructure is the interstate system. And back in the 50s, it was authorized, and there are hundreds of thousands of highways and byways that have been constructed since then. But when it came to where those highways would be built, many communities of color were uprooted to make way for that construction. And in a speech by a previous administration, Transportation Secretary Anthony Foxx, he stated that 2 decades of the federal highway system back then displaced at that time 475,000, and more than a million people were displaced. So put that in context now. Next slide, please. So the intentional segregation of Black and brown communities have been a continuation of displacement of the infrastructure within our communities. And it's intentional. Segregation is an unwritten policy by our politicians to use infrastructure. And we've all seen this, railroads, streets, different kinds of streets. It's always been a funny thing. You can tell what side of town it is by when you go across the railroad track, and you know where you are. All right. And so that's not by chance, that's intentional. So this form of intentional segregation in most cities decimated or otherwise a sustainable community. And we have to understand this suppression of American history in terms of intentional segregation using our highways and byways. And so I read a recent article that tweaked my interest in and said that the interstate highway system did not cause all the problems facing urban communities. However, its construction compounded discrimination and exploitation and triggered a process that weakened our urban neighborhoods from which we have never fully recovered. And these tools that are being presented to you, it's talking about those things as we speak. So today's residential segregation in the North, South, Midwest, and West is not the unintended consequences of individual choices. It is otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but it's the result of unhidden public policy. And so this policy was so systemic and forceful that its effects endured to the present time. And we see that right now. All right. So segregation by intentional government action is not de facto, rather it is what courts call de jure segregation by law and policy. Next. So cities and local politicians began a systematic and intentional segregation policies using these infrastructure components. Next. And so here's an example of a small community in my neck of the woods called Columbia Heights. It was created back in the 1800s for the African Americans of the Winston-Salem area. And they carved out 26 blocks. They were bought by the residents there. And this site became known as the location of the African American Educational Institution, Slater Industrial and Normal Academy, which later became Winston-Salem State Teachers College, which later became Winston-Salem State University. And so here's an example of a sustainable community that was designed specifically to create an environment of success for the African Americans in this neck of the woods. Next slide, please. However, in 1958, in this community, a highway was constructed, US 52, and it bisected this community, and it decimated the residential blocks and severed the community connections. It's now surrounded by highway tracks, industrial complexes, parkways, an enormous amount of low-income apartments, high rental areas, and exactly 3 to 4 single-family homes reside there now. It also has a NASCAR stadium that races cars almost 7 months out of the year. It also has a landfill, an organic landfill that's covered up by an asphalt parking lot that services the racetrack as well. And it's operated and owned by the city. All right, next slide, please. And it also cut off access into the neighborhood. That access now allows the residents to get in and out on 1 or 2 ways. And during the traffic for the sports events, the residents are actually cut off from getting in and out of that. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of that neighborhood and the access points in and out of that neighborhood. To the right is the racetrack. To the north is the parkways. To the east is the interstate system. And to the south are all the industrial complexes. And smack in the middle of all of that is the residential, or what's remaining of the residential area. So the infrastructure has now inundated this neighborhood, is actually trapped this neighborhood. And we talked about one of these indicators, that's traffic or transportation, and how all of that affects our community. So here's a great example. All of these indicators are trapping this community, and these residents living in there 24/7, 7 days a week, with no green spaces, no access in and out, and a continuous traffic volume 24/7, 7 days a week, 12 months a year. Next slide. And so now the current EPA training tool, EJI tool set rather, I'm sorry, is missing the opportunity to expand its ability to look at other variables of the built environment or other indicators. And next slide, please. And so here again, it's the same community, but it's inside now the EPA's environmental justice screening tool. And the drop down are the indicators for the community. You have to really drill down and define anything about the transportation. And then once you do, go to the next slide, please. You'll see that is all it would show when you click on the transportation component of it in terms of traffic. And I don't know what you could do with that, but that's all it shows. So when you're talking about impacting our communities, if you're using this tool, then it may or may not assist that. So in summary, the use of any tool to justify the greater good should be designed to represent its intended target audience with care and caution. And this EPA EJI screening tool is an example of such a tool. I don't know if it's been considered as the flagship tool for all communities, states, and federal agencies, or it's being considered for that as well. And I can think that without the addition of the built environment variables or indicators, in addition to the race, as has been talked about previously, that our communities are going to be subjected to some exclusion of these federal fundings. And the use of the EPA screening tool becomes EPA, if it becomes a federal policy, we very well may be headed back to the 1920s under the Hardin administration position of segregation of our neighborhoods, using highways and byways to be a tool of instrument for segregation of our neighborhoods. And so that was, thank you so much. And I move on to the next presenter.
Thanks so much, Dr. Graham. That was actually, well, you were actually our last presenter. We're going to open the floor up for some questions from the audience. But what an amazing, amazing panel presentation that we had today. I also just want to take some time out to introduce the founder of HEJIT, Dr. David A. Paget. He's joined us. He had an obligation, but he was able to carve out some time to join us today on this panel. So I would like to give the floor to Dr. David A. Paget just to give a little bit of information on himself and his idea for the team.
Good morning, afternoon. Yeah, Dr. David A. Paget. I am the, I guess, quote unquote lead for the HEJIT team, even though it's kind of hard to be a leader with all these great minds here. Our primary task for now is to address some of the shortcomings of the CEQ's CJIS tool. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
So thank you all. I believe that Dr. Robinson answered Taylor's question. I don't see, did you see any more questions in the chat? So Dr. Paget, you have a few minutes to kind of summarize and talk about the path forward.
Yes, we are in the process of working on a tracking tool that will track Justice 40 funding to and through the states of Texas and Louisiana as our, I guess, pilot project for now. And the emphasis is upon the so-called red states, because these red states don't have their own state tools, except for maybe North Carolina. And so also there is more of an adversarial relationship even between the state environmental agencies and environmental justice stakeholders in these states. It's not a symbiotic relationship whatsoever, maybe not even commensalism. But so these communities need support, not only in terms of doing research and using the tools for tracking, but also training and understanding what and how these funds are to be spent. Because still, when I've been on the ground and asked just people who you would assume would know, they have no idea what Justice 40 is. I mean, I'm really surprised. So if we're at that level, then technical assistance is definitely needed, even for people within agencies of government at the state level who are supposed to be working in support of these communities. So we need education, training, and of course, research. And so our team is going to use our tracking tool to do part of that. And then we've also developed the HBCU climate and environmental justice screening tool, which does include the race layer and is also on a GIS platform. Maybe it was demonstrated before I came on, but that tool is also being beta tested for use by communities to strengthen their arguments for being eligible for these funds.
Could Dr. Graham address the question from Erase the Red Line? I actually saw this exhibit in Baltimore. Well, I saw it at National Harbor, but it's been going all over the country, and good to see those folks on the call. So, Dr. Graham, or anyone actually, can you address the question?
Thank you. The answer to that is yes. Now, how we do it that's a different question, but that was the intent, to bring awareness to including the built environment into the conversation of adding it to the EJS tool set, so that communities can give input, comment-wise, pictorial-wise. Dr. LeBear is working on a survey tool that can be used to collect that type of data as well. So you can put that in there and develop this database, improve this database in terms of the built environment and the infrastructure, which is crucial to our communities. So that, yes, indeed. Anyone else?
Would anyone like to respond to Lori's point about the need for accuracy of data?
I could probably, the census is a great data collector of who and what we are, but it is not precise. And when we're talking about issues of a community, the community is what is able to really provide an accuracy of what is going on and how things are, and numbers of people and what state they're in, and housing that's not up to standard, toxicity, all of these kinds of things. We can always approximate. We can use these high level data sources, but it is the community that can bring to the table an accuracy that would be missing. And one of the things that I think we're doing is going to the community and helping them to draw out, what it really is, as opposed to what the census may have said, or other large entities that have gathered data is saying. We are going to be very specific because we're seeing it day to day within the community.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in that what's missing is the place-based specificity, and data, accurate, well specified or not, needs interpretation from context. And what I've seen, and I'm actually going to probably try to write a little paper on this, because every time I look in the city, the communities that are near historically Black universities adjacent don't have any Justice 40 designation. It's true. I just showed you it in Houston. Somebody in the comments said that area is Dillard University, where there's a gap between the surrounded by polluted areas. And I know that where I'm based in Watts, the area near Charles Drew University, which is no different than Watts and the surrounding community, does not have the designation. So what I'm seeing is that Black people in urban areas are being punished for being successful. So we're still segregated. So, but if you got your little job at the HBCU, and you got your little house nearby in the community, and you're living a little bit better, you're out. You're not getting no Justice 40 money, but the consequences of everything that the communities around you suffer from you're still bearing that brunt. So again, I link it to another. It's like, instead of driving while Black, it's living and working and being successful while Black. You're punished. I haven't looked at Baltimore, but I'm interested to see if the area around Morgan State has a similar situation. So how deep is this trend? Because I didn't know. I noticed it that in LA and in Houston, it's the area near the HBCU that is being punished by not getting any Justice 40. And I see it's in New Orleans too. So I wonder, is that true in everywhere that this black bourgeoisie and the HBC, we've built ourselves up a little bit, maybe bought some houses nearby, maybe renovated the nearby communities. You're punished. You're punished by the Biden administration, by CGIST, because you were successful. And you know what? That's a common thing. I don't want to go on a thing, but in a lot of work environments, people are punished for being successful. So I guess, American cities are no different, but it doesn't make it right. Especially when it has a racial tinge that's been hidden. The racial aspect of this is trying to skirt around that, oh, it's okay, they got money. But as Dr. Graham's presentation said, that has the historical punishment overrides having that, middle income job at the Black university. It appears from the data. Or any other. I mean, it's got to do with racism, segregation, and isolation and exclusion, which none of these tools address that yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that reminds me, Taylor had asked that earlier question in the chat about historic redlining data, both Dr. Lobert and Dr. Robinson, if you wanted to address that. I'm losing my voice, so I apologize. She had said, is historic redlining information being added? She said, has any thought been given towards adding historic redline maps to this tool? And I believe someone addressed it. Dr. Robinson addressed it. Dr. Lobert, did you have any comments?
No, go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say they put it in there, but it's from like 1924 to 1945. That's too historic. That doesn't, the second ghetto. There's a book by a guy named Seymour Hersh, The Making of the Second Ghetto. Most ghettos were formed in the 60s and 70s, as the Fair Housing Act, and then we were supposed to be allowed to integrate, but then there was reactions in every city. And so the 1970, and I know this explicitly because my dissertation addressed it, the biggest, blackest ghettos were in 1970, not 1940, right? So any kind of homeowners loan corporation exclusion that their database stops in 1945, you're not catching the processes that are important in these communities that we live in.
Yeah, and I like to add to the redlining. If you follow the built environment and the construction of highways and byways, you will see that the redlining uses those tremendously to do redlining, and so they'll carve it up along those highways and byways, and where they're not comfortable with, then they'll actually cross over and then start chopping it up. And it's amazing if you look at that. Highways and byways and those road networks, you'll see how our neighborhoods are dissected and the ways they're dissected. And then when you look at the voting and how the voting is done, the redlining uses that to its advantage. And one thing I say lastly is you got to vote. You got to vote people in the legislation. You got to put people in these communities in legislation and in power to make these rules and regulations for our communities. We're a reactive community. We don't vote people in for our interests. We vote everybody else in for their interests. And then we complain about our interests not being taken care of. So we have to be careful here and look at the reality of all this situation. We have the largest voting bloc. Geospatially, we can show you all of that, so there's no excuse for not having our legislature populated with people with our interests for our communities to make them effective, so we won't be running up into these issues all the time and be reactive to issues. So in my comment about the built environment and all the presentations that you're seeing now, geospatially, you're looking at the experts right now who can show every community how to combat all of the pushback from voting blocks, redlining, et cetera, because we can map all that stuff and we can give it to you. So we can show you how to handle it. And then we got people on this panel who sat in these discussions on redlining and whatnot and been expert witnesses. So the issue of our communities relies really in the voting box and the voting ballot. And 2024 is coming around the corner. So get out the vote, change the system, put people in the office to make it happen. Thank you.
That is such an appropriate segue. My goodness, I didn't even have to write it. That is the appropriate segue for the whole theme of the symposium, people, power, and politics. And we're excited to announce that you should stay on the symposium stream to hear someone who is going through exactly what Dr. Graham mentioned, State Representative District 86 of Tennessee, Justin Pearson, is the lunch keynote speaker to talk about what he has just gone through in Tennessee. And for those of you who do not watch the news, I don't know how you could have missed it. Justin is one of the young men. He was thrown out of his own state legislature, and Dr. Paget could tell us more about it, just for saying, I don't agree. This is not right. And he had to fight to get back in. So we want you all to join us in 5 minutes. People, Power, and Politics, the Fight for Justice in Tennessee with Justin Pearson. Thank you, speakers, Dr. Linda Lobert, Dr. Tony Graham, Dr. David Paget, Dr. Reggie Archer, Carrie Harris, PMP, Dr. Paul Robinson. Thank you so much for your work in this session. It covered all of the basics. Thank you, participants, for joining us today and engaging in the chat. We're looking forward to the future, but we know there's also a lot of work to do, because we are hearing from communities who don't know anything about Justice 40 and this money. And it will be nothing for other folks who are outside of these communities to come in and say, let us help you. Let us get this money and show you. So there's a lot to be done. Thanks, everybody. We're going to log out now.